Yep, she just recorded, so we miss PM. Okay, LO.
Okay. Can I start now?
Yeah.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The politics of hostility is not a politic that works for everyone. Not only it prevents the politician from being flexible in enacting the most favorable policy that society wants, it also creates not only political culture, but also societal culture that are hostile to the society in the ground, where people that want to hate each other will make more clashes, more resentment, more hatred, more differences because of the political narrative and propaganda that is being launched by the politicians that they do like. I'm going to present 3 arguments in my speech. First, how political culture prevents the creation of compromise in policy making, further polarize the nations, and even if creates policy, it is policy that benefits only subset fringe group of people that doesn't work for everyone. Second, I'm going to explain how hostile political culture incite real life hatred, clashes, and take up victims. And third, why in the trade-off that we're going to have centrist political system that OG doesn't want to have, that is completely fine considering the alternative is much worse. So first, about the creation of compromise in policy making, polarization, and the representation of people on the ground. Let's understand how hostile political culture works. This analysis is going to rebut the argument about check and balance and political discourse that OG wants to have. Because we believe that this hostile political culture will rely on ad hominem attack, labeling, symbolism, jargon attachment between politicians. This is the reason why Trump calls Sleepy Joe, Crook Hillary, or Crazy Bernie, and Democrats call Childish Trump and Moscow Mitch McConnell. The reason why this hostile political culture revolves around the name calling, not policy substantive, is because it is just easier for the politician to gain votes through this name calling rather than policy discussion because of 3 reasons. A, policy requires data collection, sampling, interview of public demands that are just difficult and costly to be collected. B, people are still most likely undereducated in their political education, especially in rural area in deep south in USA or in many of rural area in outside Java. C, politicians do not actually want society to actually understand their policy, as it will lead into society able to criticize the lackness of policy inactivity. So more likely ad hominem attack is likely to be enacted in hostile political culture rather than policy discussion. This is where the argument about political discourse cannot work. In our side of the house, when we have more humble, cooperative political culture, which is our alternative, the way politicians can differentiate their political identity, political ideology with their opponent, inevitably will need to be taken through policy making as their comparative advantage. They need to eventually do research, know what society wants, and give ground to earth political education so people will vote for them. And eventually, this is going to be better in trying to check and balance and create political discourse because it will make the politician be pushed to fix their policy ineffectivity. For example, right-wing libertarian Republican will need to answer to the constituents when they are being questioned. How if about the healthcare that currently people do not have subsidy on? Or the left-wing redistributive Democrat Party needs to answer to the question is how about investment if you raise people taxes? So they are going to be more likely able to have better check and balance, especially if the thing that we are trying to compete on the basis on are things that are more quantifiable through GDP growth, Gini coefficient, or income per capita that can be analyzed thoroughly. Because on the side of the house, how can you check and balance? Is Bernie Sanders crazy? Is Joe Biden sleepy? Or is Mitch McConnell close to Russia? Which will be full by a lot of misinformation. So the harm is twofold. Is first, the policy creation becomes less ideal because people actually do not know and do not understand what is the policy that is going to be created in the parliament because it's filled with unnecessary trivial name-calling political discourse, or the press of check and balance is going to be less likely to be created because it's only trivialization of this particular issue. But the second layer, let's talk about how if the policy is going to be really enacted, not only name calling, but still going to be polarized. because it will not work for everyone. You're going to have extreme polarization of left-wing party that want to have third gender bathroom, accepting all immigrants, and legalizing more equitable gender pronoun. Meanwhile, the right wing want to talk about white supremacy, attack on migrants by building the wall, or banning LGBT members from military. These are just issues that do not become the common lower denominator that work for everyone. I have 5 harms out of this. The first harm is I'm going to prove to you that 5 reasons is not only 5 reasons, but it's going to be distinctive 5 reasons. First, there's going to be deadlock between this political party. Do you know that the last policy being passed in US Senate was in 2016, which is Obamacare? And the last 4 years, there is no policy being passed because US Senate Republican and US Senate Democrat were really hostile against one another. And they do not want to concede, because when they concede, they are going to be losing the idea of hostility, the idea of opposition that they label and put the image on in the society. They don't want to be looked weak. They don't want to be looked inconsistent because of the hostile political culture. So you lose policies such as jobs creation, public infrastructure, or better healthcare because there is no policy being passed due to this deadlock. That's the first harm. The second harm, minority is going to be harmed because when you expand the Overton political window both to the right and both to the left, it means more likely it will go to the right because the right, which are filled with majority, will have more political resources. They will have more media machine, lobby, political donors. So more likely it will go to the right when you polarize this because the left-wing minority couldn't have the same political resources to do that. So minority is going to be harmed. The third harm is you are going to have either lesser political participation because the centrists do not believe that politics will work for them, which will have lower voter turnout, or even if you have massive voter turnout like what happened in the US recently, you will have massive society that do not trust the political system, while the political system makes the politician that they like lose. This is the reason why even if you have massive political participation, a lot of right-wing militia right now in the US is safeguarding and try to threatening the vote workers in this area, which makes the political institution, the democratic institution, becomes much more delegitimized. But the fourth harm is election will not always make your politician wins. And at the moment your politician that you like lose, you will not get any political solution at all because your political opponent that wins the election is going to only pander to the constituent that they like. So politics will not work for everyone eventually. But lastly, the harm is when you have these hostile political culture, especially in the election, when the passion runs high, it will create clashes. People are inspired to kill, harm each other. This is the reason why Antifa versus the Proud Boys right-wing militias have military clashes, with literally people dying on the ground due to your greediness of political hostile culture. We don't want that. We want to have better, healthier political system. Very proud to oppose.
Right. Thank you, Leader Opposition, who speaks for 7 minutes and 26 seconds. And now let's call upon the
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, please note that in our current situations, politics is always talking about the competitions, and association with this kind of identity is already been there since the very first place. For example, in every single party, there's ideology since the very first place. But what happened and what flaws in our current status quo is actually people's not being honest with their ideology and not being honest with their identity by having a certain kind of sugar coatings that their opponent is doing fine, and then trying to hide the problems and gaslight the problems into the existence of our society, so our society will not participate and not scrutinize the government since the very first place if they do something really wrong. Therefore, OG is already winning the debate because we want the sense of democracy that is full of honesty since the very first place. But one huge clarification toward the toward OO cases. Now, actually, in America nowadays, it's only recently Biden Democrats under Biden choosing dirty politics by calling out Donald Trump's failure in COVID-19. Before that, Democrats never really used this kind of dirty politics since the very first place. Democrat is already Democrat and Republic is already going through a lot of flip-flop in the idea. The first one is when Lincoln, coming from Republicans, doing the civil, doing the biggest civil act that exists in these nations, and free the slavery inside the United States. The second, and then there is a second flip. Therefore, the Democrats become more progressive. But in the third flips, when Democrats become really autocratic and pro toward the market itself, the Republican doesn't shift. Therefore, we don't want those kind of things to be happens. The polarizations effect that being explained and being really harmful coming from Sudi is not actually a good polarizations explanations or examples. It's actually the idea of people becoming more centrist and then people going into the right-wing extremisms and left-wing extremisms. We don't want those kind of things to be happens. And I will try to explain to you why it is not likely to happen if in the ideal situations through three questions. The first one, the sense of democracy in the very first place. We say the sense of democracy is actually representations coming from the identity, represent a small group, and not only representing a small group of people that can easily be pandered by the society. Therefore, we need two big party that are going to represent the communities in the very first place. Therefore, when you're talking about honesty, the ideology will be also translate to identify a string of individuals' personal traits at the very first place, and that's totally fine at the very first place. Why? Because at the time like this, when every single government is trying to compete with each other, what we want is the competition with honesty and not competition with the sugar coating that will gaslight and undermine the problems that are happening in our current status quo. The implications of this, ladies and gentlemen, how can we evaluate these kind of things? Two things. The first scenario is coming from Jokowi and Prabowo. When you are trying not demonize and not patronizing your opponent, at the end of the day, Prabowo going into the Ministry of Defense and all the problem is being forgotten. And the constituent of Jokowi, when Jokowi doing something really, really wrong at the very first place, they always believe that Jokowi is the hero and the messiah of Indonesia since the very first place. Well, it's wrong because omnibus law is being passed and being legalized. But secondly, talking about the scenario coming from United States. First of all, we can evaluate Donald Trump since the very first place. Yes, it's totally fine that political identity is most probably going to be there, and talking about Sleepy Joe and kind of things like that will most likely going to be happen. But it is not that much. At the very worst, it's just in the one-term things. But in second terms, Donald Trump is being outraged by Democrats when they are already aware that Donald Trump itself is a bad image, and even the Republicans itself trying to understand this kind of things. Well, secondly, it put Biden under the scrutiny and the spotlight. For example, Biden is being criticized to be even more being too centrist by the progressive left, the access in the Democrat itself. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, that's a good thing of check and balance that will happen in our world, because in our world there will be a constant competitions that going to fix each other and evaluate each other even more better, even when you are just the oppositions or you are the incumbent that exists in our current status quo. But thirdly, talking about the likelihood of how the policy itself will not going to be polarized by what Sudi explained before. The dynamic of the policy, most probably party will try to pander and cater toward the people itself. They need to be re-elected against. Therefore, there's an incentive structure to appease the majority and the minority, because a simple minority can be a swing voter that make them lose the elections in the very first place. But secondly, they need to maintaining the stability both economically and socially. Therefore, there's a huge incentive why Dems most probably will not going to be that polarized, because when they are that polarized, just push the buttons, and at the end of the day, we would like to reset things again by going to be united as one, like what happened in the United States right now. But lastly, talking about the trade-off that happens in our current a current society. We say that the betterment of the society will be much more better in our current side because there's a relatability coming from the emotions, coming from the participations that not only inside the elections, but before the elections, because people identify each ideology that easily be understandable because it is just a raw emotions rather than talking policies that only accessible toward people with higher educations. But lastly, talking about how that at the end of the day, it is going to be identifying the right enemies in our current scenario. Because in our current scenario, people trying to forget and trying to deny that actually Luhut is playing part in Jokowi presidency, and people coming from this constituent not admitting that Jokowi is already failing our democracy since the very first place. We are more than proud to propose. We are more likely to have a constant competition. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Speaks for 7 minutes and 20 seconds. Yeah, to close the opening half, let's call upon the DLO here.
Tes, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Wait. I'm setting up my timer. I'm gonna start my speech in 3. What's wrong with my phone? I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. One clarification before I proceed to my substantive. The only thing that glorifies by the opening government is the idea of having check and balances and whatnot. The question then becomes is that why then check and balances only exclusively come from the idea of hostility and whatnot, right? Because understand on our side of the house, when we prefer like a politics where there will be a corporations whatsoever, like a massive like bad policy from a certain incumbent government will also be check and balances in that sense, because that's a common evil that people also don't want to have and whatnot. So the idea of check and balances of omnibus law and whatsoever in the world where people are having a cooperation of politics, we say still exists on our side of the house. But then the excessive check and balances from the opening government exactly exacerbate situation and exactly will harm the people on the ground in the process that will be explained later on. So 2 things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about consistency and political participation, and lastly, I'm going to like trade off the idea of radical policy and radical flanking that might come up in closing government, right? So firstly, the idea of consistency and political participation from opening government. What they say is that consistency and truth is necessary to increase political participation because we want people to have like honesty. People need honesty for them to be able to participate in political sphere. A minus. 3 things. Firstly, it's because that there's still an idea of ideological differences in color on our side of the house. Things like US having cooperation in US politics, Republican is still conservative, like Democrat is still liberal and whatnot. In Indonesia, there are still like people who describe themselves as Islamic parties and whatsoever, and still ideological differences exist. Or even in UK, where compromises likely to exist in a parliamentary thing, like Tory and Labour Party still have a clear constituent and representation that they have on their side of the house. So it's untrue that representation and people's likelihood to participate doesn't exist on our side of the house. But second of all, the difference is that when we have cooperation on our side of the house, it sets the precedent that inter-ideological discussion and compromise is possible. This is translated into 2 things. Firstly, more cooperation in terms of policy making, right? And things like political horse trading, things like political lobbying whatsoever, only possible if you're not being hostile, right? Because this is the idea, because on our side of the house, you don't need to differentiate yourself as much to other political party, where on their side of the house, that's the most likely incentive to have, because they need to be hostile and they need to be as different as possible. Hence, less likely for them to compromise and to materialize a policy that deserved by the society in and of itself. But the second translation of this is that there will be the tipping point of winning the election on our side of the house would not be destroying other party, but rather proving your contribution to the society in and of itself. Exactly, right? Because when you have a same problem to eventually contribute on, what you will be focusing on, and one, like doing more research to the constituent and participation, because this is the only for you to have a competitive advantage towards another party instead of attacking them, for instance. But second, to do more research in policy and to have more money and funding and those kind of things to discover the root of the problem and whatsoever. So exactly, if they wanted to have a more thorough policy making, like what the Prime Minister said, it is exactly happening on our side house. These two things prove one, it is exactly what it is. This is one, that it creates less participation on their side house, because people will feel tired of unnecessary namings and whatsoever. This is exactly why the voter turnout in a lot of countries where when the countries have a lot of polarization whatsoever, a lot of people eventually not wanting to vote or doing abstention because they feel like the politics is not meaningful to them. But comparatively on our side of the house, the moment when you focus on policy and materializing policy at best in parliament, in the parliament, it is exactly make a precedence that this political sphere becomes more meaningful to people's life because they got the benefit that they deserve, they got the policy that they deserve. This is exactly why the increasing of political participation exists in opening opposition, where we have this cooperation, right, ladies and gentlemen. But thirdly, even worse, on their side of the house, it's because that people, the play field, the way that they conduct the policy, the campaigns and whatsoever on their side of the house will be destructive. One, when they're destructive, most probably that will happen in parliament. This is bad because there's no policy whatsoever materialized on their side of the house when they have these two polarizing or a lot of polarizing political party existing. But second of all, there's no policy at all which people deserve, right? Case in point, like US politics, when they're focusing on impeaching Trump, they're embedding healthcare discussion whatsoever that these African American or other vulnerable individual need the most. This is exactly why the protection of people on the ground is worse off on their side of the house, because the focus on their side of the house will be much more will be likely to be more attacking. But thirdly, this is bad because ad hominemity becomes the first weapon on them. This is likely to happen. Firstly, because this is cheaper rather than trying to deconstruct other people's policy, obviously. But second of all, this takes away the right of people to know what kind of policy discussion that exists within the status quo, because it is within their right to know, and it is within their democratical rights to know that. So in conclusion, in the paradigm of political participation whatsoever, we say wins. But even if we don't have consistency and we have to trade that off and whatnot, well, then that's fine. Two reasons. First is because that ideology is never something that is important, because people nowadays doesn't care about ideology. What they care is food on the table. This is exactly why the African American doesn't trust Democrats anymore, because there's no policy being materialized and whatnot, and they become anti-establishment, right? On our side of the house, when the political sphere becomes more like cooperative and you create more policy and materialization of policy, even if it's centrist, it creates trust that political sphere is not something, it's not a place for people to fight, but rather a place for people to give back to the society that chose them, for instance. This is exactly why ideology is something that is not something important, but rather what Zudi said about policy materialization is something that is important. But the second reason this is something that is okay, it's because that people will try to care about politics in and of itself, right? Because understand, like what they said, this is impacting to their life. So in order for them to have food on the table, they have to care about politics no matter what. So the benefit of having more political participation on their side of the house is marginal, and it's okay to trade that off. So in conclusion, the idea of political consistency not only is better on our side of the house, but trading that off to create a more policy making is something that is fine to begin with. But second of all, let's talk about the idea of radical policy, right? But understand that it is okay to be traded off, because if they wanted to protect the minority, the radical flanking on their side of the house wouldn't work, because there's a lot of externalities and it works to this polarization, and that the harm would be one, more constant attack and more political deadlock within the parliament, no policy created. But second of all, the harm is like our militia and whatnot, because this vulnerable individual becomes a target of attack from conservative people who lost, for instance. This is exactly why incentivizing the hostility whatsoever is bad for people on the ground, like what they wanted to protect, right? It's exactly better on our side house, because the idea, we prevent this kind of idea. We try to proliferate the idea that compromise something that is okay. It also translated to the constituent on the ground. We're very proud to oppose.
Right, thank you. Diallo speaks for 7 minutes and 17 seconds. Now let's call upon the government member. Here.
Okay, wait. Okay.
Gov member, do you mind turning on your camera?
Okay. Three.
Excuse me, may I share QA preference? Is it through chat or anything?
Gov member, can you let us
Three.
know what's your preferred POI method?
Through chat. Okay. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Firstly, I would like to differentiate between the closing government and opening governments. Closing governments also would like to talk about the participation in politics and stuff, like opening governments. But however, the lack of contextualization coming from opening government, why lack of the participation exists in the first place, and how the participation will be looks like in the future, ladies and gentlemen, is never clear under opening government. And this is the loophole that would like to be fulfilled by the closing government, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, we also agree with the contextualization coming from the opening opposition. So is the second differentiation between the closing government and opening government. We would like to take the debate about the polarization, but I will explain why the polarization is something which is perfectly fine under the closing government at the end of the day. So going to the stance coming from the closing governments, we encourage about the hostility. It doesn't mean cannot go hand in hand with substantive, ladies and gentlemen. For example, on how Bernie Sanders that said on how Trump is ignorant and so on and so forth, also can be substantive by following a lot of the policies and the discussion, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to show that the hostility, it doesn't mean we can't go hand in hand with the substantive of the policy at the end of the day. With that said, two things in my speech, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'm going to explain how the political culture without hostility works on, and why it is bad. I'm going to talk about how the political discourse looks like under the closing governments. So, going to the first one, how the political culture without hostility works on, and why it is. So, in the status quo, without the hostility and antagonizing culture, it makes the politics is become perceived by the society as something which is boring, attractive, at all, ladies and gentlemen. Why is this case? Because the moment politics is only depending by the policy, it means it's just not attractive for a fee, not attracted at all, because it's not giving something which is more tangible at the end of the day and more understandable to the whole of the society, ladies and gentlemen. How so? Because some people, it doesn't have any incentive to engage towards the politics simply because the policy is just too boring for them. For example, on how Green New Deal, the discussion around the Green New Deal, or even how current people can be engaging towards the policy like Green New Deal, even they do not know what the Green New Deal is, ladies and gentlemen. Or as simple as like the discussion between the socialism economic versus the capitalism economic, ladies and gentlemen. How it works and how it gives the benefits to the people at the end of the day. It's just too boring for the normal people to consume those kind of the discourse from begin with, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why, knowing on how in the status quo there is not enough incentive for people to participate in the politics at the end of the day. These contextualizations fulfill the lack of the characterization coming from the opening government, why participation is lack in the very begin with, and also negate opening opposition idea that it is enough to encourage people by the by the policy in itself, but because we already told you on how the policy is never enough as the incentive for people to participate to the politics at the end, ladies and gentlemen. So how the policies how the politics becomes more attractive under the closing government, ladies and gentlemen. Because by the hostility, it will trigger anger. And it is something which is easy to mobilize voters, to mobilize people from begin with. For example, on how the politics becomes more grounded and also clashes from the ones for another, ladies and gentlemen. For example, on how, for example, like Bernie Sanders portrays Trump as someone which is ignorant and homophobic. Of course, it will directly give incentive for LGBT people to also spend their attention towards those issues, ladies and gentlemen. So this is how the antagonizing and the hostility works on, ladies and gentlemen, on how, for example, by this issue, LGBT people becomes more attracted towards join to the politics from begin with. And that's why it makes people become more attracted and have the incentive to participate from begin with, ladies and gentlemen. It is important to make a better representative, because knowing on how the parameter of democracy is success or not is by how much people to participate in those political systems, ladies and gentlemen. Because without any participation of the people in itself, it means that we let all of the power to the elite, and that is why the essence of the democracy in itself is harmful under opening opposition side of the house. But several disclaimer: the moment we encourage hostility is never be the end of our side of the house, because hostility will be the incentive, for example, for people to research more. For example, like the LGBT people incentivized by the tweets of the Bernie Sanders, and then they would like to have incentive to even research more for those specific issue from beginning. POI from opening position.
Do you support political hostility that results into right-wing militia attacking vote center because they dislike Donald Trump losing?
Exactly, without the participation by the people to participate in this kind of terms, especially the ones who will be in power is right-wing, like Zudi said, ladies and gentlemen. Why this is the case? Because knowing on how in the political establishment era in the status quo, for example, like Indonesia or in US or in some peoples, the ones who in power is right-wing politicians, ladies and gentlemen. So exactly we need a counterbalance by triggering them by the hostility and stuff. Then that's why this is how, for example, BLM or any other leftist movement comes out, is exactly because they anger towards Donald Trump, ladies and gentlemen. And exactly you need to defend in the forms of right-wing politician in power under opening opposition. Exactly, it can be countered only exclusively by the closing governments, not valid POI. Second, I'm going to explain why the how the polarization works on will directly engage towards opening opposition. Because we would like to tell you, we would like to take the bullet that is to say polarization will exist under our side of the house, but we say polarization is perfectly fine. How so? Because how the political discourse looks like under closing governments? Because without hostility, the ones who, for example, the representative will be relatively higher under our side of the house. In the opposition, the ones who only participate is most likely is the ones who in the area in the polars, and the gray area in the centrist in itself is less likely to have incentive to join to the politics in itself, ladies and gentlemen. And why it is bad? Because the moment all of discourse of the political discourse is only represented by the extremists, by the ones who in polar, at the end of the day, it only makes the political becomes more toxic under their side of the house, and because at the end of the day, there is less likely for the centers and gray area people would like to join. But moreover, let's engage for, and that's why a participation will be better under our side of the house. But moreover, let's engage all claims talking about policy is less likely to be passed because those of the polarization. We say no, because there is still incentive for people to making a policy at the end, because the parameter of the legislative is always how the policy making is and how they want to be reelected. But moreover, there are other mechanisms, for example, like executive order, secretary statement, and that is why we say the policy making is still accessible under our side of the house. We say there are harms talking about the policy will be lax, it's not exclusive, and we are very proud to propose.
All right, thank you. Government member who speaks for 7 minutes and 29 seconds. Let's call upon the opposition member here.
Audible. So my gender pronouns is he or her. If you wish to POI me, please do it to check that. Where's my timer? I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, OO's idea will only happen under the scenario, which is the bipartite system. and on how the check and balance will be better under and they only decide that how check and balance will be better under their side. Instead, CO will prove you the further harm and the harm of the hostility between politicians, and how it will last in the long term, and on how the harm is not worth it anyway, panels. So let's move on to our rebuttals here. So first thing, OJ believe that there won't exist a check and balance under our side. But yes, we agree that check and balance from the opposite, but check and balance still exists under our status quo, because we have a society that could able to review when the government went wrong. They still able to review on how the government work. For example, the omnibus law demonstration, and this is the proof that how this check and balance still happen under status quo, and we believe that it also could happen under their side, because once you become the head of administration, you have your own agenda, you have your own goals, and also we also believe that anyone can be your opposition, right? For example, PKS now becoming the opposition, so the check and balance will still happen under our side. So CG says that the where is that the current mechanism of campaigning is boring, because people won't feel attracted because the policy is too boring for them. For example, the Green New Deal. Exactly, Panas. We don't want hostility between politicians is normalized, because they won't focus on the agenda and rather focus on how they dislike each other. We believe that people will still care anyway, because it is related to them, and it have a direct impact towards those people. For example, the Green New Deal, the environmentalists will vote towards the pro Green New Deal anyway, because they will directly impacted after. Or when you're a person who belongs to the LGBT community, of course you will vote to the people, to the politicians who have the policy which is in line with your value, and they will still care and vote for you, even though without the noisy campaigns, panels. So CG also said we need the counterbalance, but CO says that it is not worth it, because inside the parliament you will have to bargain anywhere, right? Because so we see that there is no need to portray yourself in the exact opposite of the to the public, because that would lead into greater harm, and we will explain to you and how it is not worth it. It is not worth it anyway. So our stance here is we want a world when followers don't have unhealthy tension. Also, we don't want to taint the politician image that could harm them in the long run. So let's move on to our case. So panels, we believe that it would heavily increase the tension between the followers and the politicians. They would attacking each other in the name of their favorite politicians, and will get nothing on top of that, right? And we also believe that it will taint the image of the politician itself. Politician when they are aggressively attacking their opponent, they will be known as they are the evil party in the issue, and that would impact your next election. I will explain that later in my speech. So in my speech, I will mostly talk about two things here. First, why a world where a politician treat each other with hostility is problematic, and second, the further harm and how it is not worth it anyway. Panels, let me introduce you to the urgency why it is so problematic. Because first, it could create the tension between the followers, right? When you're idolizing your favorite politicians, there will at least two scenarios happen. A, when you are irrational enough and you are only voting to your candidate based on the agenda they have, based on the value they have, and how it is in line with you, and in line with your value. And B, when you're blindly believing on your favorite politician and think that whatever your favorite do or say is the right and you should follow their path. Panels, we believe that we can be naive, but assuming that every voters are the first step, right? So we have to prepare for the worst before because at least there is a chance that people become blindly believing on their favorite politicians, and you can see the damage like what happened in Indonesia and what happened in the US. So let's move on. Let's see what happened in Indonesia and the US when the parties become way too polarized and it become very unhealthy. For example, in the United States, the Democrats decide to appoint Joe Biden because Bernie is not populist enough, and how much Joe Biden become the anti of Trump and the exact opposite of Trump. It becomes the attractive way for the Democrat. CO doesn't want that. Look at the matter of the campaign of the Joe Biden. He is not focusing on his agenda for the 4 years ahead, and rather than how much he hates them and how much to destroy them. So panels, voters will vote based on the lesser evil, right? So not because they agree with the value of the politicians that they hold. And CO says the lesser evil strategy won't last long because sooner or later you won't be the lesser evil. Someone else will. It would get this instability inside the parties because they can maintain their followers because the one they're championing is how much they are the anti of their opponent anyway, right? So we are believing that the image of the politician is also important. If you are a politician, the way you behave is how you want to portray yourself to the public, both of your supporters and to your opponent, right? When you become so much become calmer and not attacking each other, you will be seen as more wise, and it will rationalize people in the gray area or your opponent voters to go on your side instead, right? How it is going to be happen. First, let me explain you the step of rationalization. First, you have to acknowledge another idea axis, and even if it is the exact opposite on your current value. In this step, on how you deliver your idea is very important because you need to be listen first by the people who have the same who have the exact opposite idea as yours. And second is the bargaining. The bargaining is on how you acknowledging another value or idea is valid, on how you are admitting that the idea is valid, and on how you should respect it. And third is accepting panels. It means that acknowledging the idea and it slowly becomes your value too, because you are acknowledging the idea that is important and how you should follow it. Under those reasons, we beg.
Right, thank you. Opposition member speaks for 7 minutes and 20 seconds to close the government's case. Call upon the government whip. Here.
Hello, sorry Kak, I won't be turning on my camera because my internet connection is very laggy. And if you want to have a POI, please do it through chat, please. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Chair, Ku Klux Klan, Canon, neo-Nazi, they all exist even in the under opposition side of the house, right? Because you have to notice, right-wing militias exist not because one single factor of hostility coming from the politicians, but it's because ideological extremism, for example, on what they so believe at their core heart, for example. So it's an unfair burden to say that the moment we express hostility, we're going to cause those kind of extremism at the very first place, right? Because I think that it's not about the image of the certain politician that really caused them to do this kind of violent that opening opposition wants you to believe, but instead that it is ideological extremism. So in their side of the house, they also need to prove why at the moment they do not show hostility, they will also eradicate directly all this ideological extremism that exists under their side, because I think the ideological extremism still exists under their side and therefore needs better engagement. The moment we open people's eyes with discussion, for example, the moment we show hostility towards Ku Klux Klan, Scan, and neo-Nazi, I think that there needs to be sufficient engagement towards this kind of groups to begin with, right? And I think showing hostility coming from political opponents does not directly come from this. This is an unfair burden that I would not take in this debate, right? But first, before moving further, I'd like to prove why we are better than opening government. Because you have to notice the underlying premise that comes from opening government is that they want the moment that people show hostility, they will become honest. They want an honest politician. I believe that is very unrealistic, and you cannot count that very relevant, right? Closing government is the one that is realistic, that really counts the contextualization on why that political apathy is increasing right now, for example, on how that this is a realistic trigger, for example, I think that you cannot count opening government higher because of that unrealistic framework to begin with, right? So 2 things in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about the process of election participation. Second, I'm going to talk about policy making. Okay, sir, participation. Both opposition bench opening and closing talks about the moment that we are going at the moment that we show hostility, people will go blindly. People will go blindly and be irrational to begin with, right? I think that between irrationality and following a cult of personality and researching and having substantive discussion should not exist in a vacuum, right? Because the moment that you are, because it's just the matter what kind of trigger that can really help people to start the discussion and to start the engagement research and whatnot. Because this is exactly what closing government wants to address. Because none of the opposition bench wants to admit to the context that currently people are being apathetic because simply the Green New Deal is 5,000 pages, for example, or the Omnibus Law is 1,000 pages. No one dares to interpret it, and once they try, they're being seen incapable, and they're being seen as a hoaxer, for example, because they do not have the expertise to do it, right? It means that what the government wants to believe, wants to portray about the importance of this, the importance of promotion of policy in the campaign is simply not going to help their apathetical or the lack of participation under the set of the house, right? This exactly means that the moment that the comparative is the moment you use the anger, the hostility, the moment you trigger their emotion, I think that the cult of personality is something that's okay, because it's a good starting step, right? That the moment you favor a certain politician, for example, you're going to want to prove on whether the politician is better than the other opponents, right? This means that you're going to engage in Twitter discussion, for example, about why Trump is worse than Biden, and through this kind of discussion, you only need to research first, right? You have to first understand what kind of ideology, what kind of policy that Trump wants to that Trump wants to bring from the very first place, and this is the start that people wants to engage, people wants to discuss, and people want to participate in the political realm from the very first place. This is non-existent under opening and both closing opposition, because they never mention to you why centrism can finally trigger this kind of participation, why centrism is enough for people to identify. Because I think that the personal life, our daily life is already complicated enough, right? The moment we are being told to take care of those in the parliament, in the very high of White House, for example, it needs better trigger, it needs stronger political vehicle, and we say this is anger, because it's very hard for you to really access all this kind of regular Joes under the ground if you are centrist, that you even people cannot define whether you are a centrist Democrat or centrist Republican. I think that centrism doesn't really fit to the current context of demographics of electorates that are really apathetic and really have short attention span to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, I think that participation is exclusive under our side of the house, because we say that the moment that you are triggered to mobilize, for example, you are not going to stop only to stop at attacking ad hominem, for example. This is an exclusive door for you to open and to start the discussion and to start the research, where this is not happening under the government side of under the opposition side of the house. I think that the moment that we prove to you that this is a very strong political vehicle that really makes a driving force for people to fight for their belief and what they want to pursue, this is something that's better under closing government, right? On how that participation is finally going to be better under our side of the house. So, secondly, I think that on the massive distrust of participation, opening opposition also talks about there will be massive distrust on the government. I think that this is not going to happen, because this is not going to be as dramatic as they want to believe. That even if there's distrust, I think that it's normal to be skeptic of your government, and it's going to be produced as a check and balance and criticism that is productive, right? But I think that the massiveness is not going to be as dramatic, because it's not like everyone is an extremist like Ku Klux Klan to begin with. So that's on the clash of participation. Secondly, on the policy making, because notice that opening opposition's main benefit is only that when we are being centrist, we are going to have no deadlock. I think that this is unrealistic to begin with, right? Because I think that even under the parliament, they're in the opposition side of the house, their elites still have political ideology to begin with, right? What's different is what they are showing to the public. I think that these are two very different things, because I think that what they show to the public is different, but political ideology is still the same under a government and opposition bench, and that's why I think that discussion, this agreement still happens under the side of the house. But I think I want to engage that even under our side of the house, we can still pass policies even if we show hostility, right? Because the moment we show hostility, we're going to promote on how that we are going to have better policies at the end of the day. For example, I think that secondly, bipartisanship also exists in many areas of issues, right? For example, like the troop deployment is an issue of bipartisanship. But thirdly, even under protection of that really close to people, for example, I think there are a lot of mechanisms that even the parliament and the house, they really have the understanding and obligation. They need to pass policies in order for them to do their job right. I think that the irresponsible politicians like what opposition have portrayed to you is something that is simply unrealistic, right? Mr. Chair, you have to consider what kind of trigger that is enough to move this kind of apathetic demographics, which is something that is never answered by opposition bench. Proudly.
Right. Opposition Whip, you're up next.
Hello. I'm audible. I'm audible. So I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So first, we have to say that the point that from our bench of the house that's still standing is first that we explain the step by step of how it's going to harmful in the long run. Later the classing. From all of this debate, I can conclude that the classing point in this debate is whether the centrism is enough, or we should go far in choosing the ideology, the ideological value of the politician itself. Then, but we think that the centrism is enough, because my previous speaker already told you that first people will still vote anyway because it directly affects them. For example, like for the LGBT people, that they will still vote that the one that are in line with them. Also under our side of the house, under side it could lead into the rational voters. Rational voters is better because they won't create unnecessary tension, and also policy will be better because it protects all will protect all layer of people. Then there is nothing to sacrifice. Then second, we want to say the further harm and how it's and how it's worth it. First, it's the unhealthy competition. The campaign that will only what's that? That only how they rate each other. They will do anything to crush their opponent. For example, like the black campaign, they do the campaign by spreading false information and etc. And instead of developing their agenda and looking where it's lacking and where to improve, which of the society that haven't had their representative yet. The second of all is the dynamic of politics. You can what's that? You can guarantee that your opponent will forever be your will be your opponent. Our house are believe that politics is very liquid and it's being adaptable and being able to being adapt with adaptable is very important under the government side. The skill of being adaptable is won't likely to happen. Why? You will be seen as inconsistent when someday you really have to ally with the politics you hate the most. So their idea of consistency won't happen when won't happen anyway. And later. Some points of rebuttal that I want to say, that the closing government are stated about about the trigger, what kind of trigger that will going to make these people will participate anyway, and they say that it's important to make the politics to make the politics these politics matters not into something that are boring and etc. And but we believe that. But we want to say that it's okay if politics stay boring. My member already said that it's still going to at the end of the day we still can gain people attention because what's that because at the end of the day the policy that the government create will affect them anyway. And we believe that at the end of the day also the politics it's not everyone it's not everyone not every people put their interest into politics, but we can say that no matter what happens, for people who don't for those people when it comes to something that related to their life, and it's something that becomes a collective matter in our case is the causing politism, that they will automatically pay attention on this matter, and we believe it's enough to become a trigger for people to participate anyway. For example, like what happens with omnibus law, even though our people that our people that are not really into politics, that they don't really pay attention to what the government do at the end of the day, they are when these omnibus law problems are occur, they are just to care, that they just to finally put their interest in this politics because of what? Because they feel that this omnibus law will affect them anyway, and at the end of the day the contents that are in the omnibus law, it's a collective matter because it will because mostly our people are worker, and then second of all we can no matter what happens, that people when they say that people will not put their interest because the draft is so long, that they are incapable, and they are talking about the ideological thing. But we believe that that at the end of the day, people will not put ideological value that upheld by the politician itself at the top as the cherry on top of this problem. Because of what? Because at the end of the day, people don't really care whether or not the ideological value that upheld by the politician, because they only care with the policy that will create that are created by the politician itself, whether this policy will benefiting them or not, and that's why we are able to prove to you under our case that people will that under our case that people will still going to participate, and why the ideological thing is not important anyway. That's all from me. Thank you.
All right, thank you, opposition whip, who speaks for 7 minutes and 33 seconds. Everyone, please stay inside the room. Edges, let's go to Discord, yeah. And be sure to disconnect your audio first. from Zoom just to be safe.
Oke, Kak.